over the years, I have had a story or two to talk about that field behind our backyard, 30 acres where we've watched cattle graze and horses. It's not ours. We don't have to mow it, shovel manure. We just enjoy it. And watching horses gallop, well, it's been sold and they're building houses right behind us. Yeah, I felt the same way. Well, one of the disadvantages, though, of that field and having it so close to us, our house backs up right to it, was the proliferation of animals that, especially in the fall and the winter, would try and move in with us. In fact, I was a little late setting traps this fall, which I have to do each fall, and I was in my study at home, and my wife was back in the master bathroom. It was in the evening, and I heard her shriek, "There's a mouse in here!" And I could tell by the way she said it that she didn't want me to look up mouse in the Greek New Testament or work on a sermon, how to minister to mice, but, spring into action. So I set a couple of traps, and it wasn't long before that mouse entered the glory of its final resting place, wherever that may be. It's interesting, this week in my study, I came across an article that reviewed how people handle pests and varmints that want to live with them. It was really interesting. That's what provoked my thinking. This article revealed how researchers have found that people will dish out hard-earned money for exterminators only if the following pests have invaded their homes. I can't imagine whose job it is to research who uses an exterminator, but evidently somebody's doing it. 24% of adults will pay an exterminator to get rid of spiders. 27% of adults will pay to have exterminators come out and kill ants. 56% will pay to get rid of mice. 58% will pay to get rid of roaches. 90% of adults will pay to get rid of what? Cats. You guessed it. Oh, wait. No, I'm sorry. Unfortunately not. Termites. Termites. Now, I gave you that research, not just to be mean once again on all you cat lovers, but to tell you, to me, what is striking is how many people live with these varmints. Half of the people they researched didn't mind spiders and ants, roaches, mice. Even 1 out of 10 were willing, they were okay with termites. Yeah, I guess it's no big deal. They're in the garage or whatever. I don't see them. It's nothing to worry about. I found that to be a great illustration of our problem. Not only as human beings, but I can bring that right into the church as Christians, for the believer. I mean, how many Christians are willing to live with something that doesn't belong in the home of our hearts? How many believers will allow spiritual termites, ants, spiders, or whatever, and put up with it? In other words, the question is, what really bothers us enough to take action? To say, I'm going to get up out of my chair and I'm going to deal with it. Let me put it another way. What are you willing to tolerate in your life that which would invade you and trouble you and even eat away at the foundation of your faith? When my wife shrieked, "There's a mouse," she didn't want information, she wanted action. I'm convinced that what the church needs today is not simply more information, but application. Will we arrive at the point where we not only declare the right beliefs, and we're all about that, but where we demonstrate the right behavior? Now, as you know, if you've been with us in our study, the believers to whom the Apostle Peter is writing are living in a corrupt society where Everything's allowed. Move on in. Not a problem, whatever it might be. Everything is tolerated. He's writing a corrupt society where right is wrong and wrong is right. In fact, in the first century, culture was synonymous with corruption. Political, economic, moral corruption. Which meant for the believer, temptation wasn't something simply being offered in behind closed doors where no one could see. It was being bartered and sold and offered freely on Main Street. So how do you handle that kind of culture? How do you handle relentless discouragement or temptation? How do you know what to tolerate and what to exterminate? Let me put it this way. How do you stay clean in a culture that is corrupt? Well, the Apostle Peter arrives at that intersection this morning in our study. And if you have your copy of the New Testament, turn back to that letter, his first. We've just finished Peter's introductory comments in chapter 1. They have been freighted with doctrinal truths. Now we arrive at verse 13, and this is the place where New Testament Bible students identify, this is what they identify as the hinge verse that changes Peter's objective from belief to behavior. So you might somehow circle or draw a line around verses 1 to 12, and that's about belief, and now verse 13 and forward has to do with behavior. And before we dive in, let me quickly tell you that Peter's premise is really pretty simple here. If the Christian is going to stay clean, become clean, stay clean, if he's going to live a holy life in an unholy world, the solution is not isolation, and it isn't more information. It's application. Peter is going to move us to take action. Now, what I want to do as we go through these few verses is study what I'll simply call 6 steps to staying clean. In fact, you could amplify it to read 6 steps to becoming and then staying clean. This isn't for the unbeliever, to clean it up, polish his teeth and clean his nose and put on some nice clothes. This is for the believer who wants to continually become clean and stay that way. And step number 1 is simply this: get a handle on your thought life. Get a handle on your thought life. Notice verse 13. Therefore, stop. That's based upon everything we've learned thus far. Peter is effectively saying how to believe and what to believe. Now he's going to talk about how to behave. Therefore, prepare your mind for action. That verb to prepare is translated more woodenly or literally in the King James Version, which I prefer in this particular translation. It reads, gird up the loins of your mind. Gird up the loins of your mind. By the way, that verb is so rare, it occurs only here in this New Testament text. And to understand it, you got to take Peter's understanding of the Old Testament, because that's what he takes you back to. He takes you back, and we don't have time to turn there, but in the book of Exodus, you have the Passover, which is being established among the Israelite people. They've been in bondage now for 400 years. Following God's command to them through Moses, each household has slain a lamb and applied some of its blood to the doorposts of their mud slave huts. They've cooked the lamb, and all the Israelites are told, and I quote from Exodus 12:11, eat the lamb with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Why? Because you're about to be freed from your old life. For you, your lives have been spared by the blood of an innocent lamb, and you're about to begin a new life with new laws and a new direction and a new future home that's flowing with milk and honey. That's why. So get ready. Gird up your loins. To gird up your loins was a reference to someone in this ancient world to reach down and grab the back of the hem of their garment and pull it up and tuck it into their belt. That would allow them to move unencumbered and freely. It would make movement easier and faster, whether they were farming or even in combat. The last thing a Roman soldier did in the first century before going into battle was tighten his belt and limit the flowing excess of his garments. Now, what Peter does here in this text is transfer that idea of tightening up your clothing to tightening up your thinking. Tighten up, gird up the loins of your mind. That word mind refers to your thought processes. In other words, tighten up your thought processes. Get a grip on what you allow to come into your mind, to invade your mind, to move into the home of your heart. Because what's in your heart is soon going to be evidenced in your life. So tighten it up. Several commentators that I studied paraphrased this phrase. One of them said it this way: tighten up the belt around your mind. It's the idea. Another one, roll up the shirt sleeves of your mind. Another, pull your thoughts together. Whereas my dad used to tell us 4 boys growing up, use your head. We understood what that meant. Think. By the way, Peter is giving us here first and most critical step in doing battle, because the battle you face as a believer takes place primarily between your ears, in your mind. Do battle then with those thoughts that surround you, that want to invade and infest your thinking processes, because they will ultimately move in further. They're coming in through the garage. They're going to be in your living room if you don't watch it. And they will inhibit your ability to fight the fight of faith. They'll encumber your ability to run the race. This is exactly what Paul had in mind when he exhorted the believers in Corinth to destroy every speculation, every clever suggestion that attacks the knowledge of the true God. And he says, take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. I love one paraphrase of that text: fit every loose thought into the structure of a life shaped by Christ. If you want to be clean in the midst of an unclean culture, tighten up your thinking. What are you doing? What are you allowing? What are you welcoming into your mind? Don't be loose in your thinking. Mark it down. Loose thinking leads to loose what? Living. Just ask Eve. Just ask King David. Just ask his son, King Solomon. You tolerate temptation, sin. You manage a little bit of it. You make room for it. You ignore it. It's just a couple of ants. Just some termites. They're in the garage. Why bother? What can they do? No, Peter is saying, let's take action. Gird up the loins to take action. Those little thoughts, those little pesky invaders must be dealt with without compromise, without mercy, without negotiation. Get a handle on your thought life. Step number 2, get a grip on your emotion. Peter writes further in verse 13, therefore prepare your mind for action. Now notice, keep sober in spirit. Now the words in spirit are italicized, at least in my translation, because they're not a part of the original text, but added to provide a clarification. Peter isn't talking here about being sober in contrast to being drunk or intoxicated. He's talking metaphorically about being emotionally self-controlled as opposed to emotionally distorted, out of control. The word sober here could be rendered steady, calm, controlled. It can refer to someone who is carefully weighing matters at hand. In fact, one author renders this command to stay level-headed. Now keep in mind, the original audience, Peter's writing in the first century, they had every reason to panic. They had every reason to stay up at night, to overreact at every news release from Rome about what the emperor just did or what the state just decreed against Christianity. And Peter says, stay sober. Don't start staggering around out of control and lose your balance. Yes, and he admits it in this letter. He writes to them, these are indeed mind-reeling days. These are mind-numbing days. Just don't get carried away. Don't come unhinged by trouble. Don't lose your emotional level-headedness, your stability in the face of hostility or troubling circumstances or even insecure seasons. This is spiritually applying the famous words of Kipling, I think. It came to mind, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs, you'll be a man, my son. Evidence of spiritual maturity and growing. Evidence of being clean and growing in purity is getting a grip on the excesses of runaway, unbridled passions. Get a handle on your thought life. Number 2, get a grip on your emotions. Step number 3, get focused on the future. Verse 13 again, the middle part. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Fix your hope. We would say it this way. Pin your hopes on that. Pin your hope on the coming of the Lord Jesus. He's coming. You could understand this verse to read somewhat literally like this, because this is the primary verb in this text. You could understand it to say something like this. While you have girded up your minds, and you are currently getting a grip on your emotions, pin your hope on your future with Christ. Now, fixing your hope on Him is an act of the will. It isn't an emotional feeling. It is choosing to live with the expectation of His certain return. It is choosing to live in light of the coming glory. He calls it grace here. That's sort of a summary word for salvation. The ultimate and final salvation, that is, we are going to be saved ultimately from even the presence of sin. Live in that sense. In a very real sense, then, a Christian lives in the future tense. You live in the future tense. Doesn't mean you ignore the present tense, but you're all about the future. In contrast to the world of unbelievers who only live in the present. Hey, what I got to get, I got to get. I'm living for now, here and now, man. I got to get all I can in the present. Don't talk to me about tomorrow. I'm not going to think about yesterday. It's here and now for today. Get all you can while you can. Not the believer. For the believer, Peter reminds us, what excites us most isn't what happened yesterday or even what's happening today. Oh, this is great. What's going to happen tomorrow? What could happen at the revelation when we see Jesus face to face. One author wrote it this way: we live in the future tense, and our present actions and decisions are governed in light of that future life with Jesus Christ. If you're married, let me illustrate it this way. You may well remember. Some of you have been married too long to remember this, but it's fading on me. But I can remember that as soon as I got engaged, all of my thoughts and my actions and plans had to do with my future life with my bride. Everything was interpreted in light of that fact. I mean, I treated money differently, for one thing. And you as fathers treat money differently too when your daughter's going to get married, right? I treated it differently. I began saving it. As a college student, I didn't save money. Whatever loose money there was lying around went into food, more food, as much food as I could get. But after I got engaged, when I was finally able to talk Marcia into marrying me, and that's the truth, because when I proposed, she responded with, "I don't know." And I gave her 10 points that came to mind, and she finally agreed. Don't ask her, by the way. You'll get a different story. I began to save money. In fact, as a senior in college, we were in the same graduating class. One weekend, I worked on a man's property all day long. And it came time to pay me. And I said, look, instead of paying me cash, would you pay me with that table and those 4 chairs that I've seen in your storage, a little shed out back covered with dust? Would you pay me by giving me that? And he was dumbfounded, but thrilled. And he did. He paid me. Now, why in the world would I work all day for a table and chairs that did not fit in my dorm room for 6 months? Because after graduation, I was getting married. And we would need chairs and a kitchen table, somewhere for me to sit while my wife fed me. Experiments. And they were all delicious, by the way. I'm thinking about my future. All right. And by the way, while Marcia was waiting, she'd begun gathering and purchasing, and she didn't come from a wealthy home either, and carefully purchasing items and putting them in this hand-me-down beautiful cedar hope chest. Hope chest. What an appropriate name. She wasn't hoping that we'd get married. In light of the expectation of being married, she was preparing for marriage. That's the point. You want to stay clean in a corrupt culture? Don't get bogged down in the past. The enemy would love for you to stay there. Don't become too over-enamored with the present. He would delight in that, to our ruin as well. Get our focus fixed on the coming, Revelation 19, verse 9, marriage supper of the Lamb, where we, his bride, will unite with him face to face. See, in light of that, we live holy lives. See, I think John and Peter must have talked about this. It's interesting that the Spirit of God inspired both of them to say similar things. In fact, John put it this way: and we know that when he appears, we will be like him, for we'll see him just as he is. And everyone who has this hope purifies himself. That's the connection. Staying clean today has a lot to do with where we plan to be tomorrow. Maybe today. So get a grip on your emotions. Get focused on the future. Get a handle on your thought life. Step number 4, get rid of old habits. Get rid of old habits. Verse 14. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in your ignorance. Now, the word ignorance here doesn't refer to intellectual stupidity or intellectual ignorance. Peter is referring to a kind of moral ignorance that is willful, defiant, suppressing of the truth so that you can convince yourself and everyone around you in your world that what you're doing isn't really wrong. And if enough people shake their head, this is great, then you feel better. That's the kind of ignorance he's talking about. Romans chapter 1 describes it. But you, he writes, as obedient children, don't be conformed to the former lusts. I want you to notice the foundational relationship to getting rid of old habits. You are getting rid of former lusts because you have a new family likeness. I wonder how many of you grew up with brothers and or sisters, or both. Raise your hands. Look around at all the happy childhoods represented. How many of you are parents of more than one child? Yes. And isn't it amazing that you grew up with those brothers and you grew up with those sisters, and now you're parenting more than one child, and they are all so completely different. We have twin sons that are turning 31. I know I don't look it. 31. Born at the same time, entirely different. I grew up with 3 brothers. We had the same mother, same father, lived in the same house, ate the same food, went to the same church, went to the same schools, even wore the same clothing as we handed it down as missionary kids, played in the same neighborhood. But were we ever different? We had different traits, different personalities. Some of them were disobedient. Some of us were obedient. I, in fact, remember my mother, we didn't have much money, and I can remember, we didn't know it, by the way, probably like a lot of you. But we had this traditional birthday gift. She would bake or make whatever our favorite dessert was on our birthday. And we love that tradition, by the way. We could choose our favorite dessert. My older brother's choice, and I always remember this because I didn't like it at all. It was sort of a wasted event. But he loved German chocolate cake with a lot of coconut on top. Mine was always angel food cake. Which fit my personality. It really was angel food cake. Used to love it. I was just thinking about this in this light of this text. How different children are. We had different musical tastes, and we learned different instruments. My youngest brother learned the trumpet, and my younger brother next to me learned to play the guitar. I thought that was really neat. But I took piano lessons and never wanted to admit that. But my older brother, to the sheer agony of my jealous heart, was able to take accordion lessons. I mean, what a future he had in that. I mean, I was so jealous. It's interesting to me when you take that idea here to this text, that we, as children of God, for as many as received him, Christ, to them he gave the right to become children of God. As different as we are in the church, as unique as we are, we're all wired differently, different personalities, different tastes in everything. Some similarities, of course. But it's interesting to me that he says here there should be one characteristic that could be expected of all of us: obedience. In fact, you as a parent expect that. One characteristic from all of your children. Though they may be worlds apart, they need to obey. And he tells us the same thing here. Well, what does obedience look like? Well, first of all, what Peter does is tell us what it doesn't look like, and then he tells us what it does look like. Notice, as obedient children, here's what it looks like. Don't be conformed to the former lusts which were yours. Don't be conformed. Sound familiar? It's a rare verb. It only appears one other time in the New Testament, and that's Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Don't be conformed to the world, Paul writes. They're both saying the same thing. You could paraphrase it. Don't be squeezed into the mold of this world. Don't be fashioned by the world's fashion. Don't pattern your life after the world's patterns. And you know, the oldest argument, you remember as a child using it, and your children use it too. They were never taught it, they just come out with it. One of the oldest arguments to defending whatever action is we want to do is we would simply say, everybody's doing it. Everybody's doing it. Beloved, God doesn't care what everybody's doing. He knows what everybody's doing. And he, through Peter, is commanding us to fight against that undertow of the majority that wants to pull us out to see. What is this undertow? He uses the word, in a word, lust. He calls it former lusts, which is incredibly encouraging because he calls it former lusts, which informs us they can be broken. Well, what are they? Well, this word for lust, if you ransack the New Testament, you'll find that it categorizes basically a life of forbidden desires, the selfish pursuit of wealth, good things like wealth, position, pleasure, they are just taken in the wrong manner, evil longings, uncontrolled appetites, unrighteous motivation, selfish urges. You see, all that drives the unbelieving world. That is their pattern. Which is why, and you've probably noticed it, when anybody does something different than that pattern, whether they're a believer or not, everybody takes note. Wow, did you see that? That's unique. That's different. When somebody does something selfless, it can hit the newsstands. Came across this one article in a newspaper in Chicago about two newlyweds who lost all their money. This couple had left a black zippered case the size of a personal calendar or iPad on the roof of their car as they sped away from their wedding reception to begin their honeymoon. Off to a great start. The case had all of their wedding cash gifts in it, $12,000. When they reached their destination, it was gone. They realized what they had done. The newspaper ran the story. 2 days later, the newspaper followed it up. Evidently, a young Asian man named David Yi, an unemployed resident of a neighborhood through which they had driven, had found this black case, which held $12,000 worth of cash. And in spite of the fact he was unemployed, he had his own mounting bills. He tracked down the couple and gave it back to them. And I read this. After this hit the newsstands, David was inundated with job offers. And why not? Employee theft is costing corporations billions of dollars every year. There's an honest man. I got to hire him. I'm always struck by our Lord, and I want to mention him, though I've mentioned this before, who is our model. As a carpenter, more than likely apprenticed to his adoptive father, one of his chief tasks would have been to carve plows. And he no doubt worked as a young boy and into his early adulthood, probably 15, 16 years alongside Joseph, sweating over planks of wood, sanding and shaping and fastening. And it always intrigues me when I read the record of his humility in Philippians 2. Because as he aged, as he became aware of his ability and divine power, certainly into his adulthood, he could have waited till his dad went around the corner or when nobody was looking. I mean, why sweat it out? And he could have, done the proverbial twinkle of his nose or snapped his finger and poof, there it is. A perfectly carved plow. Finished. Yet because of his humility, he accepted the limitations of mankind, and he showed us how to put in an honest day's work. I'm always struck by the fact that Justin Martyr, the 2nd century church leader in Galilee, once wrote this interesting observation that farming families were still using the plows Jesus had crafted 75 years after he'd made them. What a model for a work ethic. What a contrast to the world that says, I'm going to make a deal, I'm going to make it quick, and I'm going to give you the least amount of effort I can give you. In fact, if I can fake you out and still get your money, am I clever or what? Perhaps the first step to becoming clean and staying clean for you and for me this week will be to put in an honest day's work and choose excellence as our work ethic. Get a handle on your thought life, get a grip on your emotions, get focused on the future, get rid of old habits. Step number 5 and step number 6 are for next Lord's Day. Lord willing. As you pack your things away, let me say just a couple more things. I received a letter at our Wisdom for the Heart studio. A faithful listener to the program. She didn't live in this area. She wrote that every time the program comes on, she gets out her Bible and notebook and takes notes. She went on to ask several questions in her letter for me to answer, primarily about discovering and obeying the will of God. She writes this, and I quote, "I'll do anything God tells me to do. In fact, I often tell the Lord, Lord, show me what you want me to do. I am totally open to you." What challenged me the most about this letter is that it was written by a middle schooler. It sounds a lot like someone Peter would be proud of. Someone obviously focused on pleasing the Lord above all. Someone who's pretty passionate about not allowing those spiritual termites to move in where they don't belong and eat away and work away at the foundation of your testimony.